Seconds away, round two. Now I'm going to reconvene the meeting and we'll Rose and Warwick to stand, and we're dealing with on recommendations for a local board reorganisation and representation, and we've got some recommendations here with a bit of options amongst them. So Rose and Warwick, please present your paper. Oh, and I think Julie was going to join you, but she's disappeared. Moved by Councillor Newman and seconded by Councillor Dalton. Thank you for that. Righto. Warwick or Rose.
Tēnā koutou, Your Worship and Councillors. Just a slide presentation. This is so that you have an idea of the sort of issues and the material and background that was considered by the Joint Governance Working Party in its deliberations. I intend to really skim through it fairly quickly. There'll be three sections. The first section reminds us of the two projects that we're looking at and what the processes are for each of them and how they fit together. The second section deals with the representation review of the governing body, which is what the council is required to do every 6 years. But in terms of the governing body, that section is going to look at the recommendations from the Joint Governance Working Party in terms of the total number of councillors. And then the third section is in terms of the project to do with the local board reorganisation. And so I'll start off with the background to the two projects. Review of representation arrangements for the 2025 elections. This covers the electoral arrangements for 2025. And the scope of it is the whole of the governing body, not so much the mayor, but the councillors of the governing body and all current local boards. The local board reorganisation looks at the number of local boards and it includes their representation arrangements. So these two projects are happening simultaneously. This table is copied from your report, so you can refer to this if you want to look at it in more detail in the report. The representation review is carried out under the Local Electoral Act. The reorganisation application to the Local Government Commission is carried out under the Local Government Act. The representation review looks at total number of councillors, whether they're elected at large or by wards, and if wards, their names and boundaries, number of members of local boards, subdivisions and boundaries in local boards and names of local boards. And we're required under the legislation to conduct the representation review at least every 6 years. The reorganisation application is an application to the Local Government Commission after the council resolves to adopt a reorganisation plan, and the scope of that is the number of local board boundaries and the representation arrangements for each local board. In terms of the process, for the representation review, the council has to resolve an initial proposal. It publicly notifies that, there's public submissions. The council then resolves its final proposal. There are appeals and objections which are passed on to the Local Government Commission to determine. For the reorganisation, the local board reorganisation application, the council adopts a reorganisation plan, submits it to the Local Government Commission, and the Local Government Commission will approve it or not approve it. It doesn't have the power to amend it. It will only approve it or not approve it. It will approve it if it considers that we've met all the requirements in the legislation, and there's actually a legislative directive to the Local Government Commission that it doesn't approve it if it doesn't have community support. This slide here indicates the staged process, decision-making process that we're going through. We're at stage 1 now, where the Joint Governance Working Party has considered the number of councillors and noted various local board issues that are relevant to the representation review. And it's also looked at options for further investigation for a local board reorganisation. And it's now coming back to you to make sure that we're all on the same page. There's no point proceeding to the next stage in terms of the representation review and looking at wards and so on, if we don't have some agreement as to what the total number of councillors is. And again, in terms of further investigating local board organisation or reorganisation, it's important that we agree on how many local boards before we do a lot of investigation into the case for change. Stage 3 is the public consultation on the initial proposal and the public consultation on the draft local board reorganisation plan. And stage 4 is the final proposal. Each of those stages come back to you for decision making. Now looking at the representation arrangements for 2025 elections in terms of the number of councillors. I mentioned before that the Local Electoral Act requires us firstly to consider whether councillors should all be elected at large or all be elected by ward or by a mixture. So just a brief bullet point summary of advantages and disadvantages in terms of all at large option. The advantages are that there would be more of a regional perspective in decision making. And the Mayor has previously mentioned that he is the only elected member currently who has a regional mandate. There'll be regional electoral accountability. Local board liaison would be with all local boards, could share some of the Mayor's regional responsibilities such as attending functions and so on. The disadvantages include councillors would be elected by the areas with higher voter turnout, leaving some communities without effective representation. That comes down to the very reason that you have wards, is to spread representation around. We need to note that there would be a by-election cost, a significant by-election cost if a vacancy ever arose in an at-large position. Our electoral election provider tells us on current rates that would probably be about $1.8 million. Also, there is the cost of election campaigning. The legislation sets the maximum amount of election expenses you can incur, but for an at-large position across the whole of Auckland, that's quite high, and people who are determined to succeed would probably spend close to the limit, and those candidates with more capacity would be the ones that would succeed. In terms of constituency work, it does raise a question of what are the constituencies involved? If all councillors were elected by ward, the advantages are that it spreads representation geographically, ensuring effective representation of communities of interest. Liaison with local boards is more defined, constituency work is more defined, and in a way wards are like parliamentary elections. Just a bit of a thought experiment there. Imagine if MPs were elected at large. The disadvantages of being elected by ward. Ward electoral accountability leads to local rather than regional focus and reduces the regional perspective. In terms of a mixture, is it the best of both worlds perhaps? The disadvantages is that if you, for the same council size, if you make some councillors at large, then the size of the wards of the remaining councillors increases. And we're coming to consider shortly whether rural wards need representation. If we kept current numbers and had some of our current members elected at large, there would not be specific rural representation. Wards would be too large. And again, there's the cost of by-elections for at-large positions and the cost of campaigning. That's the table of expense limits, $680,000 for at-large. In terms of whether there's any best practice for size of councillors, size of number of councillors, typically in the UK, you tend to have basically mini parliaments. We've noted there Glasgow City has 85 councillors from 23 wards. Birmingham has much the same in Glasgow and in Edinburgh, I should say. In Canada and the US, councils tend to be smaller in size, and I've quoted there Vancouver City with 10 councillors elected at large. So if there's no best practice, then the question for us is what's the right number for Auckland? And in terms of that question, what might be relevant? And to note here that since inception, the governing body has had a practice of making significant decisions in committees of the whole of the governing body plus 2 IMSB. That means decisions are made by committees of 23 people. The legal criterion for deciding these matters is effective representation of communities of interest. And so the questions in terms of this criterion is how many councillors are required to ensure effective representation of communities of interest across Auckland. Note that representation on the governing body is for making regional decisions. And for regional decisions, it is reasonable to expect that communities of interest might be larger than for local decisions. And then looking specifically at the question of do rural communities need separate representation? Do the rural areas of Rodney and Franklin need their own representation at the governing body table? If so, then these areas would set the population per councillor and therefore the total number of ward councillors. Just as a check to see what it might look like if we went to larger wards, consider a larger county's Manukau ward area comprising Franklin, Papakura, Manurewa, Otara, Papatoetoe, Mangere, Otahuhu and Howick. Just looking at the map there, got 3 wards based on police districts, a northern ward, a central ward and a county's Manukau ward. In terms of what actually does community of interest mean, the Local Government Commission has provided guidance and suggested that there are 3 dimensions to identifying communities of interest. The first dimension is perceptual. It's to do with what do residents identify with? Where do they feel that they belong to or come from? The second dimension is functional, and it's to do with the provision of government and local government services. And the third dimension is political, and that's to do with the ability of the elected body to represent the interests and reconcile the conflicts of all its members. So we'll look at applying that definition to the county's Manukau situation. In terms of the perceptual dimension, it's very true that there are a number of sports groups, for example, that consider they belong to counties Manukau. It's in their title. In terms of the functional dimension, and certainly in terms of central government services, there are police administration areas. There's a police administration district called the county's Manukau Police District, and there's a hospital administration area, the county's Manukau Health. But when you come to the political dimension, it raises issues. If you had a ward the size that was shown on that map, most voters would be in the urban areas, and therefore urban voters would elect the councillors of the county's Manukau ward. Would it matter if rural Franklin was not separately represented in regional decision making? What sort of decisions require knowledge of the rural area? For example, when considering climate issues, is it important for rural areas to be represented? So those were some of the matters that were considered by the Joint Governance Working Party, and Councillor Ferry, as the Chair, is going to speak to the recommendations from the Working Party.
Thanks, Warwick, and apologies, colleagues, for being back a little late. So this is pretty straightforward and actually something we did in, I think, November, around acknowledging that rural areas do need representation. That means we do need to have separate wards for Rodney and Franklin, and from there the maths follow, as you can see on the slide, that results in 20 councillors across wards. So, yeah.
Looking now at the question of local board reorganisation. One of the issues that comes to people's minds is the size of local boards in terms of population. And to help put that into perspective, this is a table of various city councils in New Zealand, starting with Christchurch City, but Christchurch does have a community layer of community boards. Then there's Wellington, which also has a couple of community boards, but Hamilton has a population of about 180,000 and there is no other community level. Hamilton City Council makes decisions that are have more effect, more significant than local boards, the decisions local boards make. They are able to set their own rates, and yet there is no community level. They have 14 councillors. So in my mind anyway, I see that as a bit of a yardstick. If we look at our current arrangements with local boards, the most populous is Howick, 152,500, and then Henderson Massey. I'm not going to go through the whole table. The options that were put to the Joint Governance Working Party to look at, this is a list of all of them. The first option was based on the rationale that if there are some wards which have 2 local boards in them, then you combine those local boards, and that gives you a total of 15 local boards. Then there's the Royal Commission models. And I'd just like to make another comment here when coming to the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission, around about 2009, in its report, it had spent a considerable amount of time looking at the future of governance arrangements for Auckland Council. The starting point for us when we're looking at how many local boards are optimal here can be different for different people. For those of us who've been here for quite a time, our starting point might be the current 21 local boards. And we might say, well, why change? But a different starting point is to go back to the time of the Royal Commission, which actually recommended 6. So another way of putting this whole question into perspective is to start with 6. The Royal Commission also looked at 11. The Working Party was presented with the Mayor's preferred option, which resulted in 13 local boards, and that was based on the Royal Commission model of 11, but retaining as well the 2 island local boards. And then there were other options based on current clustering. The Joint Governance Working Party focused on 2 of those options, the 15 local board options, where boards were combined if they were in the same ward, and 13 local boards, which was the Mayor's preferred option. Looking at the 15 local board model, the shaded areas on the map are those boards that are amalgamated. Looking at the table, the most populous local board is Area 2, which is a combination of Hibiscus and Basin Upper Harbour, at 184,400 people. A concern for some was whether if we had fewer local boards, that would lead to a loss of representation. After the Royal Commission presented its recommendations and Cabinet then considered them, Cabinet decided that there would be between 20 and 30 local boards and gave the Local Government Commission the task of deciding exactly how many, but said through the legislation the maximum would be 9 on a local board. That was at that time. The maximum now in the legislation is 12. So this table here shows what that might mean in terms of representation. If you combine Hibiscus and Bays and Upper Harbour, Hibiscus and Bays currently has 2 subdivisions with 4 members in each. Upper Harbour has 6 members, that's a total of 14. If they amalgamated and the new local board had a total of 12 members, you lose 2. But the 12 could be elected by way of subdivisions that represented the amalgamating areas. And so you go down the table. In terms of 13 local boards, the map there displays those 13 local boards, and the table on the right gives the population figures. We now have a maximum population of 267,700. And we believe that that population size is largely due to the question of where does FO go? When the Royal Commission made its report and its recommendations were based on the legacy council areas at the time, and FO was, what we currently know as FO, was split then between Auckland City and Waitakere. The map there shows FO going into Waitakere, and when that happens, you have that massive population of 267,000 people. The Working Party also looked at other options. Another option was FO going to the Albert Eden Pukitapapa, the number 5 area there. That brings the Waitakere population down, but it increases the Albert Eden Pukitapapa population to about the same size as the top one there. And the third option was to look at splitting FO. But there was resistance, I need to say, within the Working Party to that option, and that's understandable. We've had 13 years now of a FO local board, and they have basically identified a FO community around them. The difference between the 15 local board option and the 13 local board option can be shown in this table. And this lists those boards that are not changed. So in the 15 local board option, all of those boards there are not changed. Aotea, Great Barrier, Waiheke, Rodney, Waitemata, Oraki, Mongakiaki, Tāmaki, FO, Howick and Franklin. In the 13 local board option, FO, as I say, moves one way or the other, and Waitemata and Oraki are combined. I've got a note at the bottom of the slide there that the Working Party also considered an option 3 which retained FO and rearranged the Isthmus boards to produce 14 local boards. And the Joint Governance Working Party recommendations, I'll hand over to Councillor Ferry.
Thanks, Warwick. And I suspect this is going to be the area where people are going to have the most questions and discussion, and I welcome that. So we had quite a long discussion and debate about this. I was kind of surprised that people did want to come down to the 15 local boards, and the status quo as being the 2 options to take into early engagement, but that was genuinely the wish of the group. And so, you know, we worked it through by consensus over quite a bit of time, and that's what we came out with. I want to note that we had all members of the Joint Governance Working Party, which is 13 people, including David Taipere, present at the point where we worked through and voted on this item, except for Councillor Baker and Councillor Watson. I think everybody else was present, according to my notes. So it was quite a robust conversation. FO was one of the key issues, but it wasn't the only one. Yeah, I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about that in questions if people wish to, but that was where we came down to in the end. I would also note that our conversation on Friday is not the first time and the only time we've had the discussion. We've actually been working on this over a number of months, and really appreciated the time that staff have put in. the next step of early engagement, to my mind as the chair of that group, doesn't necessarily rule out that through early engagement there could be discussions about 13 or 14 or 42 or 9 or whatever. Yeah, that's why I picked it. So, but it is to narrow down the options analysis for staff so that we can really focus in on the pros and cons. For me, it's about testing the idea of, is 21 right? Are there benefits from a smaller number? And if there are, then let's flesh those out, have that conversation with the advisory panels, with mana whenua mata awaka, with local boards themselves and with the CCOs and the organisation about implementation. And then we come back to this group, we do some more work on the Joint Governance Working Party, we come back to this group before we approve something that goes out to actual public consultation. So there's still quite a long way to go on this process. I think that's all I wanted to say at this point, but yeah, looking forward to the questions.
Is that the end of the presentation? Okay, thanks for that. There's a couple of things that have been brought to my attention by others. When you've got, first of all, it's really good that you've come up with something which is less than 21 and gets rid of the idea that some of our councillors are representing up to 3 local boards in bits. That's nice. Could you just ask a bit about how you can't, the number 12 is the maximum you're allowed to have on a thing. Even numbers are not a good thing in boards. How would it be if we had 11? Because otherwise you're going to end up, there's a long history in democracies of trying to avoid even numbers.
I was just going to say that the Working Party has looked at that, so Councillor Ferry will speak to that.
Thanks, Warwick. Yeah, so we have discussed that at some length actually over the last few months, and covering the Albert Eden Puketapapa ward, particularly acutely aware of the situation in Albert Eden, where it's 4-4 on subdivisions, and often it's 4 from one political ticket and 4 from another political ticket. That said, the feedback that we had from local board members was that they weren't as concerned about it as I thought they would be. There didn't seem to be, people seem to be, have faith in their ability to either work through those situations or ultimately come down to, coin flips or casting votes or whatever, and to manage that. There was not a lot of feedback, I thought, anyway, from the local boards who have even numbers, that they saw that as a compelling reason to change. I would also point out that 12, when you looked at some of the numbers for those, fitting multiple local boards into 12 did mean a loss of representation, and that was seen as more of a problem, that the limit of 12 was actually a barrier potentially to amalgamating, because some areas would potentially lose representation. So I think Manurewa Papakura, for example, would potentially lose, one side would have more than the other, and it potentially creates more conflict.
So you're not considering voting across a local board, like
At large?
everyone in Howard voting at Howard large? Is that ruled out?
No, it's not ruled out. That will be in the next stage for the early engagement discussion. But if you go back to the slide Warwick had that had the breakdown, if we were to do some ring fencing of, yeah, thanks. So take for example, Manurewa Papakura, where currently you have, sorry to pick on yours, Daniel, but I just thought in the interest of not just always talking about my own patch, you would go from having 8 and 6 to probably, based on population, 7 and 5. And that would be 2 subdivisions. You wouldn't necessarily divide that further, and there might be an argument to do that. Say Albany's potentially looking at 3 subdivisions. But the reality is that where you have areas where you have higher turnout as well as higher population numbers, there's the potential there, if it's at large, for that area to dominate the elected representatives in a way that means that that other community of interest is not represented at the table. So that's a danger of at large, which we've already addressed in terms of the ward councillors at large as well. But all of this, let's keep talking about it and explore it through early engagement.
Well, we're going to go to some, first of all, thanks for the work that's all been done too. And I kept out of it as the only regional representative. And so these are questions that I fail to understand. So these are the big ones of 12. What are the other, how many of the other ones have got? Have they all got 12, 15 of them?
No.
No. So
the others are all unchanged.
they're all.
So
how many do we end up with elected local board people? Because we've got a hell of a lot of them. What's the total now?
Total now.
149 now, Your Worship, and we'll be down to 133.
Even then, that's still a pretty good pub quiz to name all 133. We're not short of them. Is it possible that we might, I'm just asking Rose and all of you, a little bit more flexibility in this? You've got 15, and maybe we 13, 14 or 15, and then maybe we had offer them 10, 11 or 12 on those ones there, or is that too complicated? We seem to have narrowed it down a little bit. First of all, well done for reducing the numbers. I didn't think it. It's very grown up. Is a little bit more flexibility for the thing okay or not? What is the view of the professionals in this field, which I'm certainly not?
I think there is the ability to change the number down. That's a maximum of 12. The important thing is that you spread representation around in a board, from my perspective, because what you don't want is having one area represented more than another in a combined local board. So you could have a smaller number, but still have subdivisions, I think is the important thing, so that representation is spread around. I would just note, though, that the remuneration of elected members is not something that we cut through all of this process, so that's a conversation that we need to have with the Remuneration Authority, but that the remuneration for elected members is set by the Remuneration Authority, and so the total number of elected members we have doesn't necessarily reduce that, but what it could do is having fewer elected members could mean that the load is spread over fewer people, but I guess what you're really asking me for is, could there be fewer of them? Yes, there could, but what's important for me to represent Auckland well and to ensure that those areas are represented well and that we cover really well the communities of interest point, that representation is spread around within that area. So that's the main thing that we're trying to get across today. Subdivisions are actually really, really important at doing that.
Could I?
My question, because I was a bit dumb and didn't follow it all, but sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Councillor.
It's okay. If I could just add to that, one of the discussions we had was around the challenge that we face from growth in a number of these areas as well. We talked quite a bit about Drury, for example, and how that might be catered for. So that in the maximum of 12, the point at the moment of the fact that none of the local boards are at the maximum of 12 was to allow for growth. So the idea was that as the population grew of a local board area, you could add more members. And so we would be at the max for all of those local boards. We wouldn't be allowed to add more in the future for growth. The other aspect is that we're actually not allowed to take into account remuneration as part of this process. That's part of the Local Government Commission rules around having this conversation. We can't consider pay at all, which means we also can't consider whether people are full-time or part-time effectively, because that goes to pay. We have had some discussions about full-time or part-time, but we can't actually base the proposal that we come out of the end of this process with, that goes to consultation and then potentially to the Local Government Commission. We can't base that on pay, can't be part of the consideration. So that's something to be aware of.
All right, thank you for that. And I've got a few questions from the floor now. The Deputy Mayor would like to ask you a question.
Thanks. I've got a couple. First, thank you for your work on this. It's obviously not easy. Look, did you consider, and I know one of the boards that isn't changing is Ōrākei, but did you consider making the Ōrākei ward and the Ōrākei local board have the same boundary? Because they don't.
So there's a preference in the legislation for local board and ward boundaries to align. As you'll be aware, they misaligned, if you like, unaligned, disconnected back in the last representation review to address the population issue in the Waitemata ward area. Yeah, and so there is a capacity through, so remembering that there's two processes here, right? There's the representation review, which we have to do every 6 years. We can change ward boundaries through that, and that's what happened last time. What we can't do is change local board boundaries through that. That has to be that has to be part of the reorganisation. So there's a potential, whichever option we go forward with, to change both of those things and potentially to align them, but it's going to primarily be driven by the population requirements, and Warwick might want to speak a little bit to that in terms of the plus or minus 10% that's required for the wards, not for the local boards. Local boards have to be a community of interest. Wards have to be within a population calculation.
Yes, that's correct. And when we started life in 2010, ward boundaries and local board boundaries were absolutely aligned. We had to, as Councillor Ferry mentioned with the 2019 review, we had to shift the Waitemata and Gulf ward boundaries because of population variances. So you really come to accept that wards and subdivisions for that matter are purely electoral boundaries and will change over time. But as you say, there is a requirement in the legislation for ward boundaries and local board boundaries to align as far as it's practicable. But an example of how it, like for 2028, for example, or to step back, if the governing body had agreed to have Māori representation, then we would have needed to have considered a Māori ward, which would have been the whole of Auckland, but then that, if we had still had a total of 20 members, that would have been 19 wards, and it doesn't take long to understand that the current configuration of ward boundaries could easily change, and that could be the case in 2028. But if for 2025 we stay with 20 councillors, we can probably stay with current ward boundaries, but do the tweaking to make sure that ones that currently don't align.
Yeah, it's just obviously very confusing in my patch when you've got them so different.
Sorry, can I just add there? I think the key point is, through this process, we can potentially realign boundaries that have got out of whack, but it's more likely we would shift the local board boundary than probably the ward boundary.
I want the local board boundary.
We'll see where we go.
Yeah, and I think the community does too, so that would be quite good. And my second question is around cost, and I noticed that the report talks about the fact that the costs will or savings or whatever it is will come later. But when you're going out to Aucklanders, will you be able to say, and I was very interested in your pay comment, will you be able to say that a reduction of local boards means a savings for Auckland of X, or is that actually not the case?
That's a key consideration. So when we actually go for formal consultation, yes, we will be able to say that. We must say that in order to get the proposal across the line, really, with the LGC. So that's one of the key. So communities of interest and the costs and benefits are the two biggest ones that we have to do the analysis of. It has to be very robust. So we'll be doing our due diligence on that from January through March, April.
And you bring that to us back again to have a look at, great.
Absolutely, before we go any further.
And so part of the process of the early engagement will include staff doing some of that work. We'll have an opportunity to test some of the assumptions and ideas around what costs and benefits are and things as we work through the early engagement as well. Yeah, so definitely the public consultation will include some financial stuff, yeah.
Councillor Baker, please.
Yeah, thanks. So, Warwick, did we look at, I guess other ways, and so did we look at the process that goes through to the Electoral Boundaries Commission, which starts with starts with statistics, the stats officer, because everything's on the table then. I mean, it's driven by population completely. And then there's a few little rules about South Island electorates, et cetera, et cetera. So did we look at that as a process? Because currently it looks to me that we are starting with our local boards and we're simply just moving them around a little bit. And we're not actually going wide and thinking, righty-ho, actually we can chop and change boundaries here, we can move things around, and accept that potentially the current boundaries that we have aren't actually fit for purpose. So did we look at that other, at another way of doing this, in terms of more aligned to how central government electoral boundaries are drawn up, and then also how they are adjusted without too much consideration about what it might mean for the history of the electorate?
My understanding with the with the Boundaries Commission and parliamentary electorates is that there's a bit of a formula. The South Island has to have some electorates and so on, and then when they work out the electoral boundaries for the North Island, I think they start from the top and work their way down. But we didn't start from a zero base. No, we start with the assumption that current boundaries more or less indicate communities of interest. Populations do change, and where people identify that can change. Perhaps a comment I could make is just there was a time many years ago where you would have a town here and a town there and a town there and paddocks in between, and it would have been very easy to say this is a community, this is a community, this is a community. Auckland now tends to be all joined up, and defining communities in a geographical sense is almost arbitrary in a way. It doesn't really answer your question, but I hope it helps.
If I could just add to that, one of the key drivers for this process is communities of interest, whereas at the parliamentary level there is much more focus on the population numbers and getting them all around the same size. So that is a key difference. One of the other things for the Local Government Commission to agree to sign off on a proposal when we get to that point in the process is that there has to be community support. We don't know yet what that looks like in the Auckland context. To give an example, at the moment none of the proposals suggest change to Howick. Maybe a boundary tweak. What if we ended up in a situation where the feedback from Howick strongly supported maintaining their representation the way it was, but also strongly supported changing representation in other parts of Auckland? Does that constitute community support or not? Times that by, however many different communities of interest. So we really don't know in that community support space what's going to count. So yes, this is a small c conservative approach, looking at 15. That's part of the reason for it, is what will we get community support for potentially. The other aspect is that the more we change the boundaries, the more we start to unpick the local board equity funding aspect, which is a significant issue. And so that's why the working party recommended that if there is going to be a significant change of boundaries for local boards, then that should be looked at for 2028 and not 2025, because it starts to become very tricky to implement. Councillor Newman was particularly hot on that. So just acknowledging his passion for resolving the local board equity issue.
Are we going to get more clever in 2028? Are we going to do harder things? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's more that, so for example, a lot of the funding, because some of the funding is based on where the assets are, if you change the boundaries in ways that shift an asset or shift an asset's catchment, then potentially you've got some quite big implications in terms of how the funding model works.
Thank you for that. Councillor Filipaina, please.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, Julie, well done to you and your working group, and also to you, Warwick and Rose. Reading in option 1, I'm interested to find out the numbers with the new boards and which of the amalgamated boards, for example, in each of the 12 that you have there, And for example, with East Coast Bays 4, Hibiscus Coast 4, you then split them up into 3. Which one will miss out? Because obviously are there 1 or 2 that will miss out with a less, without another member, because you're reducing from 14 to 12. So has that been knuckled down even further? Wouldn't it be good to have that sort of go through? Because if I was living in East Coast Bays, I would want to know if I'm going to have 1 less member. You know, I mean, I think that's important if we're looking at representation across. The same would apply to Waitakere, Rangers in Henderson and Massey, and also in my current ward. So is that information going to go out to the public in regards to consultation?
Thank you, Councillor. As I mentioned at the start, this was a very quick skim through what was considered by the Working Party. I'm sure there is a slide which breaks down the subdivision arrangements more than this does. But when we're looking at subdivisions, all we need to be aware of is the plus or minus 10% rule. So, for example, with that new Albany local board, and you've got 3 subdivisions, East Coast Bays, Hibiscus Coast and Upper Harbour, you could have 4 in each, depending on where you draw the boundaries. You've just got to draw the boundaries to ensure that you comply with the 10% rule. Is it?
Just further to that, so just to remind people, what we're talking about here is what we take into the early engagement process. This is not what we take into the public consultation process. The early engagement will help us to flesh out all of this stuff and come up with more precision that would go into the public consultation process. So, and as Warwick points out, a lot of the subdivision numbers are based on population and where you draw those lines. You know, it might be that East Coast Bays, Hibiscus Coast and Upper Harbour had 3 each. You know, you would just have to see where the lines were, and that's the work we need to do through early engagement and have those conversations.
So that's why I'm asking at least around that with the initially what we've got. Mm-hmm. And it's good to know, at least I can go back and each of the councillors here can go back to their area and say, here is what you will lose or you will gain one. That I think is so important. Another question, Chair, is at some stage when we do go out for public consultation that the status quo is one of the options? Okay, yep, I can confirm that. Also,
Absolutely.
yeah, and the last one for me is, I know when the vote around Māori representation in Māori ward happened, there was an undertaking that the Working Party would be looking at Māori representation. Will that be coming later in regards to, okay.
We've had some initial discussions about that. It's not on this agenda item because this is just about the representation project, but happy to have a conversation with you about how that's progressing offline.
Kilda, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, please, Councillor Ken Turner, please.
Hi, I haven't been following this. I thought that the driver was less politicians, quicker, faster, better decision making. Is that what we were driving for?
The driving motivation is better, more effective democratic decision making. What that looks like is a political discussion that we're working through as part of this process.
And the real savings is in our pastoral care. When I see, like we seem to have a raft of people running around behind us all, just answering our questions, etc. So each one of us has pastoral care, and that must be a huge cost. For example, at Watercare one day I said to them, is there anything you'd like me to take back to the governing body? And they said, yeah, do you know how much it costs to answer 140 politicians' questions every week? And so, I thought when the mayor started talking about this that we were looking at efficiencies and a nucleus of a machine that worked better. Just, are we?
I would just first of all note that Watercare are missing out on 30 elected members, so, because there's 170, but not 140. But I think that that may be something that comes out of this, fewer elected members, but the motivation that we have to have through the Local Government Commission staff is around reflecting communities of interest as effective decision making. I really welcome anyone coming along to the discussions we're having at the Joint Governance Working Party. We're not meeting again till the 2nd of February, but be very happy to have people along to participate or watch. But I think Rose is going to give you a non-political answer.
Thank you. And it's me who gets the 130 wrong, not Watercare. They get the figures right. Thank you.
Can I just comment as well? It's really I suppose, a strategic point. Even if you have a view that that should be one of the objectives here, I would caution against making it too prominent in the argument to the Local Government Commission, because they are looking at it through an entirely different lens, which is the representation and democracy lens.
I think it's fair to say too, from a staff perspective, because we need the organisation, in fact the group's perspective on this as well, is what will these changes mean for them? It's about communities of interest, but it's also about how well those new local entities, if we go ahead, will actually serve their communities and how well the organisation's able to serve those elected members. So one would argue that having fewer might be easier, but local boards currently have a view that we're not doing a good enough job as it is. So, we really need to factor in what is the future of these new entities, what do they need to do a great job, because whether there's 13 or 15 or 21 of them, that's the real goal, is that they're serving their communities well. And so when we're doing the cost-benefit analysis, that's what we're going to look at.
Thank you. The people tell me they'd vote for one representative if it brought potholes fixed, speed humps gone, better roads. That's all the people are looking for, and I just want to, I don't know, it's just want to see it. Thank you.
Councillor Darby will clarify everything instantaneously.
No, I won't be doing that. Probably got a question or two. Look, I appreciate. I've not participated in the group, Julie, but I respect all the work that's been done there, and I sort of see that we're coming to this numbers arrangement. And for me, I sort of just go back to the first principle of what's the problem, and from what's the problem, how are Aucklanders, not us, not politicians, better off? How are Aucklanders better off? So when you look at the legislation, the setup of local boards, it's actually very interesting the way it's worded. It's not about democratic decision making just by decision makers. It actually says by communities. That's the first preference, is by communities. And so I'm interested in how are Aucklanders, the communities of Aucklanders, better off by this recommendation, and what's the evidence supporting that? And because I'm not fascinated by the numbers, I'm fascinated by how Aucklanders are better represented, how community engagement is enriched to a whole new level before you get to carving up the numbers.
This stage of it is really just about giving us permission to go forward. So you're going to make that decision about whether there is a problem that needs resolving before we go out to formal consultation. So I just want to be really clear that you have another opportunity by which you could say, no, we're not convinced. But what I would say is that we've had a lot of feedback that things are not working. And in fact, from local boards themselves quite regularly, many around this table have asked for us to look at change and for us to look at change thoroughly. In fact, I think you, Councillor, yourself wanted us to have a look at that in a previous term of council. So we have an opportunity to do that now. The legislation has been changed so that Auckland can look at the number of councillors. We have an opportunity to do a representation review and a reorg together. We're taking that opportunity to have a look at whether current arrangements actually work best for Auckland after 13 years of having done this. We've got a lot of evidence behind this. I think you're right, it is about what communities need. and representation, but it's also just fair to say that 21 of anything is awfully complex for this organisation to manage. It's an opportunity for us to look at whether having fewer local boards might mean that those local boards could do better because they are better resourced, because we're clear about what they're doing. We're going to have a look at what the roles and responsibilities of local boards are through this process. The Mayor's asked us to do that alongside the rep review. So this is a chance after 13 years. I don't have a view on whether 13, 15 or 21 is right, but what we're asking you for today is the opportunity to do the analysis.
Look, I appreciate that. I don't want to discount the work that you've been doing here, Julie. It's very valuable. Just briefly from me, I won't labour the point, but you know, I've often gone back and looked at those two systemic problems the Royal Commission reminded us of, Warwick and Rose, and the second one was community engagement is poor. Well, that was the identified problem then. So 13 years on, are we better, or are we as poor, or are we poorer? And I would be really interested in some, not work by us and local boards. You've got to ask communities about that. The answer's only there. It's not here. We can have our opinions and observations, but I'm really interested in, is community engagement better 13 years on? How do we find out the answer to that? Because that's pretty fundamental to moving forward.
I think one of the other things I would note, I'll let Rose pick this up in a minute, is that probably whether community engagement is better will differ quite widely across the region as well. My experience, 12 years on Puketapapa local board, I'm not, you know, I think it's very timely that we review this, and I'm quite happy to be going forward on this, even though, you know, as I said at the joint hui with IMSB, I'm, you know, yet to be convinced that fewer is better, but let's see where we go. Open mind, not an empty mind, right? But my experience on Puketapapa was in the first term, we would routinely get fewer submissions than Waiheke, despite having nearly 10 times the population. We didn't get people turn up to any conversations with us, partly because we were doing them wrong. And that has radically changed. It's still not as good as it could be or should be. And then you take somewhere like Waiheke, where they've got a fantastic history of community engagement and continue to have that fantastic level of engagement. So there's a lot of nuance to work through here. And I'm minded particularly of Waitakere City. You know, I hear sometimes from colleagues in the West, you know, people talk about the glory days of Waitakere City. My experience is that I don't hear that about Auckland City in my area. Maybe other parts of the old Auckland City do. And I know that some parts of the North Shore City, you know, miss those days, and other parts are happy that they've got a local board that's closer to them. But yeah, we're just going to have to test all of that. And for me, that's the value of this process actually, is that whether we come out with a recommendation of no change or some change or lots of change, we're going to have tested all of this out and analysed it and had those conversations, which I think is of enormous value.
Councillor Hills, please.
I don't think I remember, but the Future for Local Government process, which is probably done because the government's changed, but had a lot of this embedded through it and around support for councillors, local boards, things like that. If you think of MPs and cost, I think they have 3 staff, officers, expense accounts, not that I need an expense account, but there is lots of KiwiSaver, all sorts of different things that is different for local government for some reason. Is that being looked at through this, or is it very separate? Because sometimes I think if councillors had some support structure within the local board for constituency help or whatever that is, that would be we would waste a lot less time that Councillor Turner's talking about. Or is that all quite separate from this conversation? Because in my opinion, it's not necessarily about the numbers, it's about the resources to help us get information to and from.
And I think that's a really valid point, but it's up to us in conversation with the community and then the Local Government Commission to sign off on an elected member structure, and then it's up to the organisation to match the resources. So I would note that, yes, MPs do have I've seen that up close, MPs do have a much higher level of support than we do, but they also operate on quite a different level than we do. Some of the work that they have to do with government departments, for example. So, none of us has to deal with kāinga ora queries, for example. A lot of staff time in some areas for MPs is taken up by dealing with kāinga ora issues, whereas we just send them on. So there is a significant difference in terms of the constituency queries, I think.
Question, thank you. Councillor Sayers, are you out there somewhere?
I am, Your Worship. Thank you very much. My question was kind of around we talked a little bit earlier about the equity funding between local boards and how those, how those are kind of made up in the asset placement, etc. But is it possible or appropriate, just would like some advice, if any dollar savings that were made by any reduction in local number of local board members, if that can be ring-fenced for such things, e.g. Going back into restabilising that equity issue at all. Could I just get some thoughts on that? Then I have another question.
Any cost savings through the equity work, as I've understood them, are going to be ring-fenced back into the local boards. But there's actually just kind of the redistribution matter that you're dealing with through the equity work. What I would say is, if there are savings to be made by having fewer of something, fewer local boards, fewer local entities, then that would be your decision as to what that money is used to or redistributed to do at a later point in this process. But I would say that because we're looking at what the Mayor's asked us to do as more empowered, better funded, and potentially fewer local boards, that I would say that fewer might lead to less costs, but the more empowered is likely to lead to more costs. So it might be a zero-sum game, there might be some savings, but what is really important through all of this is that whatever we do devise through this is well equipped to do the work. I would suggest that there might be savings through fewer, but if you want to make them also local, more empowered, then there goes your savings. But that might be a really good thing.
I do need to comment that if there were operational savings and support costs and what have you, don't forget that I've also got to find quite sizable savings in the organisation that is already accounted for elsewhere in the projected LTP. So, and to be honest, my suspicion is that it would pale in comparison to the size of the investment required were you to fix the equity problem by investing more money.
All right, that's helpful, Phil. That kind of answers my question. The other part, I guess, just for the public record more than anything else, in terms of elected local board members and their remuneration, is it correct that they are self-employed contractors, effectively, and they are not entitled to any other expense or benefits, including annual leave, sick leave, parental leave, or any Kiwi Saver packages with the Auckland Council?
You are correct in that elected members are classified to be self-employed. They receive remuneration as set out by the REM authority. That amount is fixed, it's got nothing to do with Auckland Council, but we must pay it. Also, you are entitled to expenses as per the elected member expense policy, which is also set out in the Remuneration Authority's determination every year. And you yourselves make a decision often about what kinds of expenses you're willing to cover. For instance, you can cover childcare costs. At the moment you don't, but you could do that. But you do travel, you do cover travel costs at the moment. So the REM authority lays out the regime of cost you may claim for. You make a decision as a governing body on which of those you will. But once you've made a decision, the cost, the way the costs are spread, the way the costs are actually paid out is determined by the REM authority. But you are self-employed.
And only the REM authority can mandate superannuation arrangements for you.
Yeah, and just to note, Greg, yes, we are not entitled to any of those forms of leave that apply under the Holidays Act to ordinary workers, because we are not classed as ordinary workers, and I've personally gone through that with paid parental leave.
All right.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think it's helpful for the public to know that. I guess just listening to the questions and debates, and ideas being shared around, I'm sitting in a point which you might be able to help me with. If we had more local boards in 21, would that give better community engagement and responsibility? I think your point that you made, Rose, was a very good one. It's about the empowerment that we can actually give local boards. And if we had less local board members out there covering Auckland, more like, if it was 13, does that necessarily mean better community representation? Maybe not necessarily for the same argument. So, it's really probably boils down, in my mind, to the quality of the elected local board members, who the public choose to have them represent them, and the individual efforts that those members make to engage and undertake community engagement. That's what boils down to me, in my mind. And your comment was very helpful in terms of to support that to be even more effective is the amount of empowerment we can give them through the work we're doing now. So sorry, that's more of a comment, Your Worship, than a question, but just trying to let people know where my thinking's at around this. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. Can I just comment that we didn't discuss increasing the number of local boards or indeed increasing the number of ward councillors, partly because the direction from the Mayor was to look at fewer, and also because my sense was that the politics around the table probably wasn't going to support an increase in either of those. So we haven't explored that further. That said, I did have a constituent raise with me the idea that actually we should base all of this on the current electoral system, and that used to be the case under the Auckland Regional Authority. So maybe that's something to pick up in a future conversation, but not for this round.
Yeah, very good. All right. Thank you for those comments, Julie.
Okay, Councillor Walker, please.
Got a couple of questions. One of them is pertinent to any change to Hibiscus and Bays and Upper Harbour as it goes to Albany. And the context is that you're talking about a vast area and many locations that absolutely have no community of interest, any identity with each other. West Harbour, pretty much the north-western motorway at one bound, Campbell's Bay at another bound, Waiwera at another bound, and all sorts of locations in between. So a question I'd put is under an arrangement where you do have a combination, like say this new Albany configuration, is it conceivable that you could have subcommittees within that local board, that a large local board, with delegated authorities to effectively, deal with stuff, and then they'd all come together every now and again and they'd sort stuff out? Can that work?
Your Worship, the answer to that, the short answer is yes. It's up to the local board itself.
The short answer is fine. The short answer is fine.
I was going to mention the example of the former Rodney District Council.
Yep.
You know what I'm going to say.
And I'm familiar with that. So the other question I'd put is if the issue that we're solving in part is around engagement and identity and a whole bundle of things, surely we need to address that through some form of civics education or some form of civic strategy, which we don't have. And I've covered off a number of those things previously. And maybe that is a real underlying problem, because my experience when I have a chat with people, and I do that all the time, they've got very little idea as to how this outfit works. They've got less and less idea about the history of it because there's less and less written down. I mean, Decently in an Order, Advance in Order, Graham Bassett's publication, all those histories, I mean, they're years ago now. And we've got an entirely different setup now. So I guess my question is, what do we need to do to address that? Because I would suggest that just changing boundaries and the like really doesn't solve an underlying problem that may be getting worse in terms of people's identity with locations and perhaps with Auckland.
I don't know if that needed an answer. I mean, there's 1.6 million opinions on this, and we've got down to a few here and so I think you've made good progress. That map's pretty good. The weirdest thing of all in this whole thing that no one's mentioned is that the densest, most densely populated part of New Zealand by far is the CBD, and somehow or other it's tied up with Great Barrier, which is the least densely populated part of New Zealand, into one ward. Now how did that happen? I would have thought when you're looking at that map there, if you're going to combine anything, AOT has probably got more to do with Rodney.
Mr Mayor, I can explain that to you through Parliament. It was always said that lines of communication were the most important things to keep electoral integrity together. So things like the Chatham Islands were originally included in one of the Christchurch seats. And then when the flight started going out of Wellington Airport, Chatham's became part of Rongotai, simply because of where the communication systems were to get people to and from. Nothing to do with location I mean, you know, Great Barrier is probably closer to Rodney than it is to Auckland Central, but the communications of people movement and so on is there.
Oh, in that case, they should be part of the Coromandel then. No, but Coromandel is more in the region of Aotea than this is.
It's been mooted before.
That was what
I'm afraid that wasn't in the parameters that were set for the Joint Governance Working Party to consider trading Aotea Great Barrier off to another regional authority.
Oh, there you go. And thank you for that brilliant explanation there from Councillor Morris Williamson, who understands Wellington thinking better than I can. That's very good indeed. It still doesn't make any sense to me, but it's very good that I've got an explanation. Well, I think, is anyone prepared to move this, or does anyone want to amend it or anything like that?
To move an amendment if I can.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to move an amendment to C. And in C, where you've got 15 local boards, I would like that to read 12 to 15, because I don't want to limit us to just to the 15 and then be hamstrung by it. I would rather put it 12 to 15 as an amendment.
Point of order, can I just check that we are moving into debate? Because if we are, then the staff can step back and I will return to my seat.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Well, I'm not quite sure whether you can move an amendment before or after, but...
No, you have to wait until we're in debate.
I thought that's what he just said we were doing.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just checking with the chair.
No, that's very...
no
I'll
harsh
take
on
that
you.
advice from you, thank you very
Yeah.
much, and you
Okay.
two can step back.
Thank you, well done.
You can come back and join us.
So I'm happy to second that.
Hang on.
Yeah, that's my problem.
So, Councillor Williamson has not chosen to ask a question. He has chosen to move straight to an amendment. If he wishes to ask a question, then he should do that before we close questions and move into debate. If he waits until debate to put it as an amendment, then he loses his opportunity to get an answer to his question.
Okay, well,
Okay, on that basis, you two step back, you come and sit back in your seat, and we'll see if he's got a seconder for the motion.
Question?
not really, no.
He's got a seconder.
Yeah.
I've got a second.
Order.
And that-
No
no.
advice, please. Off you go, you two.
Sorry, Chair, I don't know if it's probably not a point of order, but I guess my issue is not knowing what the effect of that is a question.
Oh, just...
If we're asked to make decisions on amendments which we don't know the full effect of. But at the moment, Councillor Williamson has offered to have an amendment that goes between 12 and 15, is that correct?
So I'd like to speak to that if I can now.
And he's got a seconder in the form of councillor Turner.